I have thought about how to begin this account for a long time. Years, if I'm honest. There are official versions, the inquest findings, the ministry summary, the 2 paragraphs in the scientific literature that describe what happened to Victor Caroon in the language of pathology and containment failure. Those accounts are accurate, in the way that a photograph of a battlefield is accurate. They capture the shape of it. They do not capture the smell. My name is Gordon Briscoe. I am a physician. I was, at the time, the flight medical officer attached to the British Experimental Rocket Group's first crewed deep space program, a position that carried with it a great deal of prestige, and as I would discover, a very specific and permanent kind of damage. I am writing this now because the men who were there are getting old, and the men who came after us have begun to repeat the story wrong. They make it sound like a triumph. Clean and uncomplicated, the kind of story that ends with shaking hands and a new policy directive. It wasn't that. It costs something that doesn't show up in any official ledger, and I think it should be written down before the last of us who understand the cost are no longer here to explain it. I will start where it started for me, which is not at the launch. I was there for the launch, but that was a formality. 3 men sealed into a pressurized capsule atop several million pounds of controlled explosion, with me standing at the medical station checking telemetry that told me their heart rates were elevated, which anyone could have predicted. Victor Caroon, Ernst Reichenheim, Dale Green. I knew their resting heart rates better than I knew my own. I had spent 8 months watching them exercise, bleed, sleep, argue, recover from illness and recover from boredom. I knew which of them snored. I knew which of them was frightened of the launch, and which of them was frightened of the silence that would follow. I was as close to those 3 men as you can be to another person, while maintaining the professional distance the job requires. Caroon was the mission commander, a compact, precise man from the Midlands, 38 years old, 12 years of military aviation before the program found him. He spoke little and meant everything he said, which made him excellent company if you were paying attention. Reichenheim was the systems engineer, a Frankfurt-born physicist who had come to Britain on a fellowship and stayed, as some men do, because the work suited him and he liked the rain. He had a methodical mind and a dry, occasionally bruising sense of humor, and he could argue experimental design with Quatermass for 3 hours without either of them raising his voice. Green was the flight specialist, younger than the other 2 by several years, the kind of easy competence that makes the genuinely difficult look routine. He'd been recommended to the program by 4 separate external bodies, which was unprecedented, and he wore that distinction with enough self-awareness to know it wasn't something to mention. 3 good men. I want that on the record. Before the numbers and the biology and the accounts of what they became, they were 3 good men who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway, and I had spent 8 months in close proximity to that choice without fully understanding what it would eventually require of them. The launch was clean. Telemetry was nominal for the first 11 hours, then it wasn't. I was asleep in the residential block when Patterson came for me. John Patterson, Quatermass's senior engineer, a tall, dry Scotsman who wore competence the way other men wear expensive watches, quietly and without drawing attention to it. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which told me before he spoke that this was not a drill. "Controls lost the signal," he said. "Quatermass wants you in the medical bay." I was dressed and moving before he finished the sentence. The control room at that hour had a particular quality. The overhead lights still on their night setting, the screens casting blue light across the faces of the technicians, everyone speaking in the clipped, precise cadence of people who have decided not to panic yet. Professor Bernard Quatermass was standing at the central console with his hands braced on the edge of it, staring at a telemetry readout that had gone to static. He was not a man who showed fear. He showed instead a kind of ferocious concentration, as though the problem were simply a lock he had not yet found the right key for. He was 51 years old at the time, and had been doing this kind of work since before most of the technicians in that room were born, and he had the bearing of a man who had made peace with with the fact that the universe frequently failed to cooperate with his plans, and had decided that the correct response was to keep planning anyway. "Gordon," he said when I came in, not a greeting, a statement of location. "What happened?" "We don't know. Signal went a noise approximately 40 minutes ago. We've been attempting to reestablish." He straightened and turned to look at me. The capsule's biosystems went dark at the same moment. Partial data packet came through before the dropout. "I want you to look at the medical telemetry before we brief the ministry." I looked at it. I spent 20 minutes looking at it, running it through the analysis programs twice, then a third time by hand because the numbers were not numbers I was prepared to accept the first 2 times. The biosigns in that final packet were wrong. Not flatlined, which would have been simpler, which would have meant death and grief, and a very grim few weeks. They were wrong in a way I did not have language for. Karun's cardiac rhythm had become irregular in a pattern I had never encountered in 15 years of medicine. Reichenheim's neural activity indicators had peaked far beyond any recorded human maximum, and then simply ceased. Green's were the most disturbing. They appeared briefly to have merged with Karun's, a single oscillating trace where 2 separate ones should have been, before dropping off entirely. I sat with that data for a moment, and then told Quatermass what I had seen. He listened without expression. Then he said very quietly, "They're still up there." It was not a question. "I believe so," I said. "Or Karun is, the others." I stopped. "Say it." "I don't know what to call what the others are." He nodded once, as if I had confirmed something he had already suspected and hoped was wrong. That was the moment, though I didn't know it then, that the nature of the problem changed. We were no longer talking about a failed mission. We were talking about something else entirely, something that didn't have a name yet. 2 days later, they brought the capsule down. The reentry was rough and uncontrolled, and the capsule came down in a field in Essex, not in the designated landing zone. By the time I arrived on site, the emergency services had already cut the hatch and Victor Karun was out. He was alive. He was conscious. After a fashion, his eyes were open, and he could walk with assistance, and he responded to his name. But the look in his eyes was not the look of a man who had just returned from the edge of space and the edge of death. It was the look of a man who was listening to something no one else could hear. The other 2 crew compartments were empty, not breached, not damaged, simply empty, as though Reichenheim and Green had walked out somewhere between the upper atmosphere and the ground. I remember standing in the field, the capsule tilted at 30 degrees into the soft Essex soil, and looking at those empty spaces. The straps were still buckled. The helmets were still racked in their holders. There was no blood, no sign of trauma, no evidence of the kind of catastrophic decompression event that could account for 2 grown men being simply absent. They were gone the way a thought goes, suddenly and completely, and without leaving an obvious trace of where they had been. The army cordon was up within the hour. I stayed with Karun in the field while the cordon established itself around us, sitting in the back of a military medical vehicle with the capsule hatch visible through the open rear doors, that tilted silver cylinder in the soft soil, and trying to do a field assessment on a man who sat completely still and looked at his hands. Karun's hands were the thing I kept returning to, specifically his left hand. There was nothing obviously wrong with it, no trauma, no discoloration, no sign of the kind of physiological damage you would expect from 2 days in a capsule that had undergone the stresses the telemetry suggested. But he kept looking at it, turning it over, examining it with an attention that had nothing to do with medical concern, and everything to do with something I did not yet have a category for. I asked him about his colleagues. He looked at me steadily for a moment before answering. "They're still here," he said. I assumed he meant in the capsule, and said as gently as I could that the capsule was empty, that we had looked, that there was no sign of them aboard. "Not in the capsule," he said, and went back to looking at his hand. Quatermass arrived on site by late afternoon, and by evening we had Karun in the medical facility at the program's London headquarters where I could monitor him properly. His vitals were stable. His temperature was slightly elevated, 37.9, nothing alarming on its own. His blood pressure was within normal range. He responded to light stimulus, to pain, to his name. On a standard neurological assessment, he would have passed for a man suffering from acute disorientation after a traumatic experience, which is what the initial report filed by the duty nurse said, because she had no other category to put him in, and the truth was not yet available. His blood work was something else. There were compounds in his serum that I could not identify, complex molecular chains, long-form organic structures that had no business being in a human circulatory system. I sent samples to 3 separate laboratories with instructions to prioritize, and I began the business of trying to characterize what I was seeing from first principles, which is what you do when the reference books don't contain what you're looking at. I sat with Victor Karun through that first night. He didn't say much. He answered questions in monosyllables, with long pauses between them, as though translating from some interior language. He ate when I put food in front of him mechanically, without evident hunger or satisfaction. He tracked movement with his eyes. He slept, or appeared to sleep, for several hours, and during that time the monitors showed a neural pattern that I had never seen in a sleeping human being. The delta waves were present but structured around something else, some higher frequency oscillation that I could not classify, organized almost, rhythmic in a way that suggested something other than rest. In the morning he spoke German. Not accidentally, not in his sleep. Victor Karun was from Birmingham. He had no German. I had confirmed this during the mission screening process 8 months earlier, in a routine linguistic assessment that existed primarily to flag potential communication issues during multinational operations. He had joked about it, said he could manage bit and dank, and not much more. But he woke from whatever that sleep was and asked me, in clear, unaccented German, where Ernst Reichenheim's instruments had been stored. I answered in English. He frowned, as though remembering himself, and then blinked, and when he looked at me again, he was Karun again, or the thing that was wearing Karun's face was approximating Karun more closely. "Sorry," he said in English. I got confused." "What were you confused about, Victor?" He looked at his hands, his left hand in particular, though at that point there was nothing visibly wrong with it. He turned it over. He looked at his palm the way a man looks at something he half recognizes from a long time ago. "There are 3 of us," he said. "It's hard to remember which one is supposed to talk." I called Quatermass immediately. He arrived within the hour, with Patterson and Lomax, the ministry's man, a civil servant of the particular type that institutions produce when they want someone who is authoritative without being inconveniently independent. Lomax had a tight mouth and a habit of reminding us, at intervals, what we were legally permitted to disclose. He had no scientific background, and he compensated for this in the way people, without scientific background, often do in positions of authority over scientific matters, which is to emphasize process and classification and the importance of correct procedure, as though the universe observes ministry protocols. He wanted the data, all of it immediately classified to his office. He was not wrong to want this, in the narrow sense that the data was extraordinary, and extraordinary data is the kind of thing that creates problems if it circulates without control. But his priorities were, from the beginning, in conflict with ours. He wanted to manage what had happened. We wanted to understand it. These are not the same project, and the difference between them would matter considerably in the days that followed. Quatermass handled Lomax the way he handled all bureaucratic friction, not by confronting it directly, which would have produced resistance, but by moving slightly faster than the friction could keep up with. By the time Lomax had drafted his first classification requirement, Quatermass had already shared the telemetry data with 2 additional analytical contacts outside the ministry's knowledge. This was technically outside procedure, and Quatermass was aware of it and did not particularly care, which was one of the things that made him extraordinary at his work and occasionally exhausting as a colleague. Quatermass listened to my account of the German, of what Karun had said, and then he sat down across from Karun and talked to him directly, in that measured, unhurried way he had, as though they were having a conversation about something ordinary. He had a gift for that, for not telegraphing his alarm, for keeping his voice at a register that invited honesty rather than deflection. Karun told him, in pieces, in fragments, with long silences in between, that he remembered the mission up to approximately the 42nd hour. He remembered the instruments beginning to behave strangely, readings that made no sense against any of the expected parameters. He remembered a light, not outside the capsule, but inside it, and not a light that you could see with your eyes exactly, more something that the instruments registered and the body registered, and the mind registered all separately and somehow in the wrong order. He remembered reaching for the radio and finding that his hand was not entirely his hand anymore. He said this without distress. That was the thing I kept returning to in my notes, in the margins of the clinical record. The flatness of it, as though the horror of what he was describing had been processed by something that did not experience horror, or had been processed so thoroughly and so completely that the emotional content had been extracted, and what remained was pure information. After that, he said, it was like trying to remember a dream from inside a different dream. Quatermass asked him about Reichenheim and Green. Karun looked down at his hands again. They're here, he said. They're both here, it's crowded. He said it with no particular emotion. That was the part that stayed with me, long after everything else had resolved itself into the shape of a memory. Just those two words, it's crowded, said in the tone of a man reporting a minor inconvenience. The next 36 hours were the most intensive diagnostic work of my career. We ran every test we had available: blood panels, neural imaging, cellular analysis, metabolic profiling, bacterial and viral screens, radiation exposure assessments. We ran them all, and then we ran tests we improvised on the spot, using equipment that was not designed for the specific purpose but could be adapted. Patterson contributed, which surprised me. His engineering instincts were sharper than most scientists, and he had a particular facility for designing measurement approaches on the fly, for finding ways to quantify things that had not previously needed quantifying. The picture that assembled itself was one that I kept hoping I was misreading. The foreign molecular chains in Karun's blood were not a contamination. They were structural. They had integrated into his cellular machinery at a level that made the word contamination meaningless. They were not infecting his cells. They were becoming his cells, replacing the original architecture with something new that used the same materials but operated according to different rules. His nervous system was expanding. New connections forming at a rate that had no medical precedent. Axonal growth that should have taken months was occurring over hours, and it was not random growth, not the chaotic proliferation you see in neurological damage. It was directed. It had a plan, or something equivalent to a plan, in an entity that might not think in terms of plans. The capacity of his brain was not diminishing, as you might expect from a pathological process. It was increasing, incorporating. I wrote that word in my notes and then looked at it for a while. Incorporating. It was the most accurate word I could find, and it troubled me in ways that took some time to fully articulate. The cactus gave us the first clear answer. There was a cactus in the window of the medical bay, a stubby, unremarkable thing in a terracotta pot, the kind of plant that ends up in institutional spaces because it requires almost no maintenance and occupies a windowsill without drama. Someone had put it there at some point, and no one had moved it. It had been there through Karun's admission without incident. On the second evening, during what I thought was a quiet period, I had stepped out to get coffee and consult with the overnight nurse about the monitoring schedule. She came to find me. She was a steady woman who did not alarm easily. She had worked in military field hospitals. She had seen trauma that would have broken less resilient people, and she had the particular calm that comes from having been frightened so many times that you have made a kind of working peace with the state. She was alarmed. Karun had put his hand into the cactus. Not grabbed it, put his hand into it, deliberately palm flat against the needles, and held it there. By the time the nurse noticed, the cactus was dead, not wilted, not damaged, dead the way a battery goes dead completely all at once, as though something had extracted everything useful from it and discarded the remainder. The terracotta pot was undisturbed. The soil was undisturbed. The plant was simply, completely, thoroughly dead. And Karun's hand, when she pulled him away from it, had a quality to it that she described to me, choosing her words carefully, as greener than it should be. She thought it was a trick of the light. In the fluorescent wash of the medical bay, things could look odd. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either. I looked at the cellular samples under the microscope, and I sat with what I saw for longer than I have ever sat with a laboratory finding. There were plant cells in Victor Karun's hand, not alongside his cells, not an infection, not a contamination in any conventional sense. Incorporated into them, woven into the existing structure, sharing membranes, sharing function. The boundary between animal tissue and vegetable tissue, the boundary that has been absolute and unquestioned for the entire history of life on this planet, had simply ceased to apply. I went and found Quatermass and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long time. We were standing in the corridor outside the medical bay, the door between us and Karun closed, and I could hear faintly through it the sound of Karun breathing, slow and regular and entirely too calm. "It absorbs," Quatermass said finally. "Whatever it touched in space it absorbed, the two men, now the plant. It adds what it encounters to what it already is." "Yes. And if it reaches the outside, then it has access to considerably more to absorb. Everything, every living thing it comes into contact with." He looked at the door. In the blue-white light of the corridor, he looked older than he had 2 days ago, though perhaps it was simply that I was looking more carefully. How long before the transformation reaches a point of no return, if such a point exists? I don't know. It's accelerating. The rate of change last night was slower than the rate of change this morning. Whatever is driving it is getting better at driving it, or the substrate is becoming more capable. "Both, probably," Quatermass said. He had the look of a man assembling a theory he would very much prefer not to have confirmed. The more it absorbs, the more processing capacity it has. The more capacity it has, the more efficiently it can drive the absorption. Which means it's not linear. It's exponential if we allow it to continue. He straightened. We need more than what we have here. I want to bring in additional analytical support. And Karun. More contained, he said, and there was something in his voice that I had not heard from him before, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a problem that might be larger than his capacity to solve it. For Quatermass, I think that was the closest thing to fear he allowed himself. The acknowledgement of a ceiling. We increased the security on the medical bay that night. Additional personnel at the door, electronic reinforcement on the locks, remote monitoring via a secondary system that ran independently of the primary network. We briefed the additional staff with as much of the truth as we judged they could operationally absorb without losing the ability to do their jobs, which meant we told them Karun was a biohazard risk and should not be touched or permitted to touch anything in the room without full protective protocols. And we did not tell them the things that would have required a longer conversation. It didn't matter. In the small hours of the following morning, Victor Karun walked out. He left through a reinforced door that should not have opened from the inside and simply was open, its electronic lock mechanism fused, not forced, not broken, fused, as though the components had been locally heated to the point of deformation and then cooled again in a locked-open position. The 2 guards were found on the floor of the corridor, unharmed, breathing normally, their memories of the preceding hour entirely absent. Not confused, not vague, absent. Cleanly removed, as though someone had gone through their recent experience and excised the relevant portion with surgical precision. I was the one who found the guards. I was called in by the monitoring technician who'd flagged the camera dropout, and I arrived to find the door open and the men on the floor and the bed empty, and the cactus pot on the windowsill holding nothing but dead soil. I stood in the empty medical bay at 3 in the morning and looked at the impression Karun had left in the bed's surface and tried to understand what we were now facing and what it was going to take to face it. The answer, I concluded, was more than we currently had. The police were involved from that point, whether the ministry liked it or not. Lomax did his best to manage the information flow. He was genuinely skilled at that particular kind of management, the art of being forthcoming about things that didn't matter in order to maintain the impression of cooperation while protecting the things that did. But a man walking out of a secure medical facility under those circumstances generates its own momentum in the information environment. People saw things. The guards talked, even if they couldn't remember the relevant hour. The nurse talked. The monitoring technician talked. And Fullalove, the journalist who had been circling the story since the capsule came down, with the particular persistence of someone who knows the shape of a story even before he knows its contents, was already asking questions that were too specific to be guesswork. Fullalove was not a man I would have chosen to have involved. He had the quality that good journalists share with good detectives, which is a refusal to accept the comfortable explanation when the uncomfortable one fits the evidence better, and a very well-calibrated sense of when he was being managed. He had asked early on, at a press briefing about the capsule recovery, whether the sole survivor's condition was consistent with the physical effects of the mission parameters, and the person answering the briefing had said yes, which was technically accurate and comprehensively misleading, and Fullalove had nodded in a way that made clear he had filed the answer and would be returning to examine it later. He knew something had come back wrong. He was just trying to establish the shape of the wrong. We traced Karun through a pharmacist's shop in Waitekapel. The pharmacist was found alive but in a state of profound shock from which he did not emerge for several days, and the shop stock of several specific compounds had been taken. Not stolen, the locks were intact, the window glass was clear, the till was untouched. The compounds had simply been removed from their containers, which remained empty and undisturbed on the shelves where they had been. Nitrogen-rich fertilizing agents, catalytic accelerants, specific enzyme compounds that a biochemist would recognize as the precursors to rapid organic synthesis. Things that, combined in the correct proportions and introduced to the right biological substrate, would accelerate cellular growth by several orders of magnitude. Karun had come and gone like water through a membrane, and the specific compounds he had chosen told me, with a precision that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with my own heart, exactly what the organism was preparing to do. It was building towards something. The transformation was not random, not chaotic. Not the simple spreading contamination of a pathogen. It had a direction, an endpoint. The alien biology that had come down inside Karun was moving toward a specific final state, and it was using Karun's knowledge and Reichenheim's knowledge and Green's knowledge, 3 sets of human scientific understanding now available to a non-human intelligence that had not previously had access to them, to understand what it needed and how to get it. Quatermass understood it before I finished laying out the evidence. He had a particular quality of mind that I have never encountered in anyone else, the ability to assemble a conclusion faster than other people can assemble the data that supports it, and to be right. Not always, but with a frequency that was unsettling until you got used to it. Sporulation, he said. Yes. It's going to reproduce. At a scale commensurate with its mass, yes, which at current growth rates would be sufficient to seed the entire planet. He said it quietly, without drama, just a man doing arithmetic and not enjoying the answer. I said nothing. The arithmetic was not complicated, and it went in only one direction. What does it need to complete the process? What it's already gathering. The catalytic compounds from the pharmacy will accelerate the final stage of cellular division. The time it needs is narrowing. It needs mass. The more biological material it can incorporate before sporulation, the wider the dispersal range. But the compounds it took will compress the timeline significantly. How long? Hours, possibly less than hours. The rate of change has been non-linear from the beginning, and the acceleration is itself accelerating. He was quiet. I watched him think, that particular quality of stillness he had when he was working a problem at the edge of his capacity, like a man assembling something in complete darkness by touch alone. The control room around us was subdued and tense, the technicians running tracking algorithms and cross-referencing surveillance data. Everyone who was awake at that hour doing the work without looking up, because looking up required acknowledging the scale of what they were helping to manage. There's a chance, he said, that the men are still in there. The alien biology has incorporated them. Their physical structures have been. Not their physical structures, their neural patterns, the organized activity you described in the sleep monitoring. The German, his voice speaking as himself with Reichenheim's memories available. Whatever it incorporated whole. It didn't digest them, Gordon. It kept them. I understood then where he was going, and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that what he was proposing was not a medical intervention or a scientific procedure or anything else within the categories of things I knew how to evaluate. What he was proposing was an act of faith in human persistence, and I have never been certain whether acts of faith in the face of evidence fall on the right side of the line between courage and recklessness. I said nothing that would have stopped him. The trail led us to a decommissioned power station on the south bank of the river, a vast industrial cathedral that had been converted to cultural use, its turbine hall repurposed as gallery space, its brick exterior massive and indifferent to the centuries that had passed over it. Someone had called in a sighting at dusk, a shape seen moving in the dark inside the building, through a high window, something that did not move the way a man moves. By the time we arrived, the police had established a perimeter 200 meters back, and the army had arrived with armored vehicles and equipment sufficient to manage a problem that needed managing through the application of significant force. Lomax was there, managing competing priorities with the strained efficiency of a man trying to hold a very large sheet in a crosswind. Fullilov was there, behind the cordon, with his notebook and his deliberate, watchful stillness. He looked at me once, across the distance of the perimeter barrier, and did not ask a question because he had understood enough to know that any answer I gave him would be incomplete, and he was the kind of journalist who would rather wait for the complete version. Quatermass stood at the edge of the cordon and looked at the building. The military commander, a compact man with the economy of movement that senior field officers develop as a professional habit, the kind of man who has spent enough time in proximity to catastrophic failure that he has made a working peace with the possibility, came to stand beside him. They looked at the building together for a moment without speaking, two men trying to make a decision about something that none of the available decision-making frameworks had been designed to handle. "We can take it out," the commander said. "Shape charges on the load-bearing columns. Bring the roof down, contain what's inside, let the structural collapse do the work." Quatermass said, "If we kill it by force, the spores release on death. That's the biology. Destroy the body and you aerosolize everything it was carrying, everything it was ready to disseminate." The commander absorbed this without visible reaction. He was a man who had dealt with biological hazard situations in his career and understood the particular calculus of containment. "What's the alternative?" "The alternative," Quatermass said, "is that I go in and talk to it." There was a silence of the kind that forms around genuinely unexpected statements. Not a shocked silence, not an offended one, but the silence of people reassessing what they thought was a shared understanding of the available options. "It's not human," the commander said carefully. He was not dismissing the idea. He was doing what careful men do, which is identify the foundational assumption that needs to hold for the plan to work. "Part of it is," Quatermass said. I stepped forward. "I'll go with you." Quatermass looked at me. His expression did not change, but there was something behind his eyes that I read, then and now, as gratitude. "No. Victor Carroon is my patient," I said. "Whatever he is now, whatever the process has made of him, he was my patient from the beginning of this program. I knew him. If there is any part of him left that can be reached." "Gordon." His voice was quiet and final and kind, all three things simultaneously, which is a difficult combination to argue with. "If this fails, someone needs to describe how it failed. You're the physician. You're the one who understood the biology from the beginning, who kept the records, who can explain what happened in terms that the people who come after us will be able to use. You need to be outside." A pause. "And you know I'm right." I did know. I hated it and I knew it. He walked toward the building alone. No protective equipment. No weapon of any kind. A man in a dark coat and sensible shoes, walking across wet concrete toward an industrial building in which something that had begun as three human beings was completing a transformation that would, if uninterrupted, end the relevance of the word human to the future of this planet. I stood at the perimeter and watched him go. The inside of the building was dark. We learned the details afterward from the account he gave from his hospital bed, speaking slowly, with the careful precision of a man reconstructing something he had experienced at a level that exceeded the capacity of his ordinary memory to file it cleanly. The turbine hall was enormous, the full uninterrupted volume of what had once been a generating plant, raw concrete and iron and old brick, a space designed for machinery that did not need to be comfortable in, built to a scale that reminded the human body of its own comparative smallness. He could hear it before he could see it. Not a sound exactly, not sound in the frequency range that ears are designed for. A vibration. Something that registered in the inner ear and in the sternum and in the molars simultaneously, at a frequency that human bodies recognize as significant without being able to explain why. The way you recognize the presence of something very large without being able to see it. He said it was not unpleasant, which surprised him. He had expected something that felt like threat. What he felt was more like proximity to something vast and simply indifferent, and in the dark of a building that smelled of old oil and river damp, he found that indifference more frightening than hostility would have been. He walked toward the far end of the hall. His footsteps on the concrete floor were audible and specific, the only human-scale sound in the space. It was at the far wall. It had grown. The Carroon who had walked out of the medical bay 2 nights before had been a man, recognizably, still a man. Ill and strange, and occupied by something other than himself, but man-shaped and man-sized. What occupied the far end of the turbine hall was none of those things anymore. The transformation had continued through 2 days of freedom, access to the open air, access to the biological richness of a city, access to the catalytic compounds that had compressed the timeline, and it had taken a final form that had no equivalent in any biological taxonomy. Part animal in its origins, part vegetable in its new structures, part something that those two categories together were insufficient to describe. Something that had taken the raw materials of 3 human nervous systems and an alien consciousness, and the contents of a pharmacist's shelves, and assembled from them a thing that was entirely and absolutely its own category of being. It had colonized the wall at the far end of the hall, spreading across the concrete in structures that were simultaneously root-like and neural, a vast filamentous network, spreading 10, 15 meters in every direction, pulsing with something that was not quite circulation and not quite electrical impulse but had properties of both. At its center, subsumed entirely within the growth, was a mass that had once been a man. Quatermass stopped, 20 feet from it, maybe less. "Victor," he said. He said later that the fear was there, but it was not the useful kind of fear, not the kind that gives you sharp eyes and fast legs and good decision-making under pressure. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from standing in the presence of something so much larger and older than yourself that the concept of your significance becomes genuinely uncertain. The organism did not move toward him. It was aware of him. He was certain of that from the moment he stepped into the hall. Some quality of the vibration changed, some attention shifted. But the awareness had no predatory quality. It registered him the way a garden registers a man standing at its edge, noticing, not moving to close the distance. "Victor," he said again, "it's Quatermass. I need to speak with you." The vibration changed, a subtle modulation, barely perceptible, but he had been listening carefully and he noticed it. "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. I know it's crowded, as you said. I know what you are now is not what you were, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He kept his voice even, conversational, the tone he used in briefings, clear and unhurried, communicating that there was no immediate emergency in the manner of speaking itself even when there was one in the content. "I'm not here to tell you that you can come back. You can't. I think you know that." The mass at the wall moved, not toward him. A slow, interior movement, like very deep water responding to a pressure change somewhere far below the surface. "But you can choose," he said. "Whatever you've become, whatever that thing that came aboard you in the void has made of you, you still have that. Because I know who you were. I know Karun ran 12 years of military aviation before this program. I know Reichenheim argued experimental design for 3 hours without raising his voice. I know Green was the kind of pilot that 4 separate professional bodies recommended before we'd finished asking. I knew all 3 of you. And men like that don't simply stop being who they were just because something larger moved in. That's not how it works with men like that." He said the silence that followed was the longest of his life. Not in measured time, probably under a minute, he thought, though he could not be certain, but in the quality of it. He stood in the dark in that enormous space with something that could have ended him in any number of ways and waited. And then, faintly, from somewhere inside the mass, not from a mouth or an approximation of a mouth, not from any visible point of origin, but transmitted through the structure of the thing directly into the air around him in a way that his ears received but could not quite account for mechanically, he heard a voice. Victor Karun's voice. Thin and distant and utterly exhausted, the voice of a man who had been managing an impossible situation for longer than a man should be expected to manage anything. "It won't stop," Karun said. "We tried, all 3 of us. We've been trying since whatever it was first found us. It doesn't understand stop, Professor. It doesn't have a concept of stop. It only knows continue." "I know," Quatermass said. "It'll spore. We can't prevent it from inside. It's almost time. The compounds it took accelerated everything. We tried to slow it, but there's only 3 of us and it's—" A pause that had a specific quality of exhaustion in it. "It's very large." "You can prevent it." A pause longer than the first. He said he could feel the weight of whatever was happening inside the organism during that pause, something he described as a pressure change in the air of the hall, a quality of held breath, as though the vast network on the wall was itself waiting. "How?" Karun said. "You know how." The silence again. Then, Reichenheim's asking if you're certain. "Yes." "He wants to know if anyone would be certain, in our position." Quatermass thought about it. "No," he said, "not certain, but I'd want someone to ask anyway." A sound that might have been, very distantly, a man almost laughing. Green says, a pause with something different in it, something that, in a man's face, you would have called grief. Green says we worked too bloody hard to go out like this. "I know," Quatermass said. "Tell him I know. Tell him it matters that he knows it." He backed away then. Steadily, not running, keeping his face toward the wall, because what was about to happen was not something a human body could be adjacent to and remain intact. He walked backward across 20 feet of concrete floor toward the side door of the turbine hall, and the wall was already beginning to change, the filamentous network illuminating from within, brightening in stages. A warm light that was not bioluminescence and was not electricity, but was something closer to the last expenditure of 3 human nervous systems, choosing the manner and direction of their own dissolution. He went through the side door. I saw it from outside the perimeter, a light from the high windows of the turbine hall, brief and total, and of a quality that has no good comparison in ordinary experience. Not fire, not explosion, not electricity, the light of something releasing the last of itself all at once, in a direction it had chosen. It lasted 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Then the hall was dark again, and the vibration I had felt in my chest even from 200 meters distance, the subsonic signature of the organism at its most fully realized, was simply gone, as though a sound you had been hearing so constantly that you had stopped hearing it had finally stopped, and the absence of it was louder than anything. The building was empty when we went in. Not empty of all trace, there were residue patterns along the far wall, carbonized material in the filamentous configuration, a smell that no one could agree on a description for and that faded within an hour, but empty of the thing itself and empty of its potential. The spores were not released. The dispersal event did not occur. Whatever Karun and Reichenheim and Green had done to bring the aliens' reproductive cycle to a terminus before it completed, it had worked. The biology was finished. The crisis was over. 3 men were dead. 3 men who had, in any meaningful sense, been dead since the 42nd hour of the mission, when something found them in the dark between planets and decided they were useful raw material. They had nonetheless chosen, at the end, how they would stop. In the presence of a non-human intelligence of sufficient age and sophistication, to traverse the void between worlds and to incorporate every form of life it encountered into itself. They had retained the one faculty that the organism apparently had no mechanism to absorb: the willingness to say no. We held a memorial service 3 weeks later, a small and necessarily vague ceremony at which the official language did most of the heavy lifting, and the people who had actually been involved stood at the back and said little. Judith Karun attended. She stood in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the framed photographs and said nothing during the service, and thanked each of us individually afterward with a composure that cost her something visible, but that she maintained regardless. She asked me before she left whether he had been himself at the end. Not whether he had been in pain, whether he had been himself. I told her yes, that at the end, whatever else he had become, he had been the man who chose. She nodded once, and her hands were very still, and she did not ask for elaboration, and I thought then and think now that she had understood more than I had said. The willingness to say no. I have thought about that for the years since. I think about it most in the context of what the organism was. We concluded in the studies that followed, and the studies went on for years. The residue material alone generated 6 years of academic work, that it was ancient. Not old in the way geological formations are old, though it was certainly that. Old in the way that implies accumulated experience, accumulated process, a long history of doing the same thing in the same way, because the same way had always worked. It had been traversing space for what our models suggested was a span of time that makes the history of life on Earth look like an afternoon. It had encountered life before. The sophistication and specificity of the absorption mechanism was not the product of a single encounter. It had refined itself over iterations. It had found life and absorbed it, and moved on and found more life, and absorbed that too, adding each encounter to what it already was, growing more capable with each addition. It had, in all that time and all those encounters, apparently never absorbed an intelligence that would argue with its own absorption. That is the human hook, if you want to call it that. Not our technology, not our weapons or our science or the particular configuration of our civilizations. The stubbornness, the refusal to be useful on someone else's terms, the deeply ingrained, evolutionarily ancient, frequently inconvenient insistence on being specifically and individually ourselves, even when the alternative is to be part of something vastly larger and older and more capable than we are. Karun was from Birmingham. Reichenheim had a wife and 2 daughters in Leatherhead. Green had a bet with another pilot about who would get more vertical hours before the end of the decade, a bet that was now, technically, unresolvable. These facts, the small, particular, entirely ungeneralizable facts of who those men specifically were apparently sufficient, in some fundamental sense, to constitute a resistance that a non-human intelligence of immense age and capability could not quietly digest. The official record says the crisis was resolved by Professor Quatermass's intervention. That is accurate as far as it goes. What the official record does not say is that the intervention consisted entirely of asking 3 men to make one final choice, and trusting them to make the right one. The record does not capture what that trust requires, or what it costs the person who extends it. Quatermass was in hospital for 3 weeks after that night in neurological symptoms, the specialists said, consistent with extreme stress response, though none of them had a satisfactory model for why standing in proximity to the organism would produce the specific neurological effects they were observing. He recovered. He went back to work. He never spoke of it publicly. The one time I asked him directly, perhaps 6 months after, sitting in his office at the end of a long day, he looked at me for a moment and then said, with the matter-of-fact certainty he brought to everything that mattered, "They chose correctly. That's the whole of it," and changed the subject. That was his way. He had said what needed saying in the turbine hall, and he was not going to spend energy on its repetition. Fullilove published what he could, which was accurate in its outlines and careful in its specifics, the work of a man who understood the difference between the story the public was ready to receive and the story that had actually happened. I read it and could not object to it, though it was, for those of us who had been in the building and in the field and in the medical bay at 3 in the morning, an outline with a great deal of important material left in the white space. He got one thing exactly right, that the men who went up were good men, and that what happened in between was not a failure of science or of the program, but an encounter with something that no existing framework had prepared us to anticipate. He said it carefully. I have no complaint with it. The program continued. There were new protocols, new screening procedures, new quarantine specifications, informed, at last, by what we now knew was possible. Arguments about risk and timeline, the kind of arguments that institutions have when they are trying to accommodate a genuinely new category of risk, without substantially altering the plans they had already committed to. Quatermass argued for caution, as he always argued for caution, his version of caution being considerably more rigorous than anyone else's, calibrated as it was to the actual scale of what we had encountered rather than the comfortable version the ministry preferred. The compromise was the usual kind, imperfect and functional, and the launches continued on a revised schedule. I left the program 8 months after, not because I was forced to, and not because I had lost faith in the work. I left because I had stood in a medical bay at 3 in the morning and looked at the empty bed of my patient, and I had understood something that the inquiries and the reports and the new quarantine specifications could not quite articulate. We had sent 3 men into a void we did not understand, and the void had done with them what voids do when they encounter something useful. We had been fortunate, in the very specific, unrepeatable sense that the something the void found useful turned out to be capable of a kind of resistance that we had not designed and could not have manufactured. Next time, we might not be so fortunate. The thing might encounter a nervous system that was tired or damaged or simply not as stubborn as Victor Karun's, and on that day the outcome would be different. I think about that. I think we should all think about that, those of us who are involved in the work of sending human beings into the dark where things live that are larger and older and more capable than we are. I think we should think carefully about what we are actually sending, beyond the instruments and the training and the mission parameters. We are sending specific people. We are sending the accumulated weight of individual lives, the irreducible particularity of who a person specifically is. And it turns out that particularity is not simply a human interest element in the mission package. It is the mechanism. It is what makes what travels harder to absorb than anything else we could put in the capsule. There are things in the dark between planets that are patient in ways we cannot fully comprehend. They do not hate us. They do not regard us with malice or contempt or any feeling at all. They encounter us and assess us and determine that we are useful material, and they proceed accordingly. The only counter to that, demonstrated once and at considerable cost, is the discovery that what they have incorporated can still, in some last interior space that the absorption cannot reach, choose not to cooperate. Men have been arguing with the universe about their own significance since we were clever enough to understand that the universe was indifferent to it. We have been insisting, in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary, that we are worth something, that our particular configuration of matter deserves to persist, that our choices matter even when nothing is listening. We have been doing this for a very long time, and we are apparently very bad at stopping. The organism that came down inside Victor Carroon had no mechanism for that. It had no category for an intelligence that would refuse to be useful. It had absorbed species that might have been smarter than us, faster than us, longer-lived than us. It had never absorbed a species that would argue. That distinction kept the world. It cost 3 men their lives and 1 man 3 weeks in a neurological ward, and the rest of us a particular kind of permanent unease that I have no better word for than knowledge. We know now, in the way you can only know something by having stood close enough to it to feel the heat, what is in the dark. We know it is vast and old and not cruel, merely indifferent, which is in some ways worse than cruel because indifference cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be persuaded, and cannot be appealed to through any of the ordinary channels that human beings have developed for managing the things that threaten them. We can only be, apparently, too stubborn and too loud and too specifically ourselves to be quietly absorbed. I have thought about worse legacies. Victor Carroon, Ernst Reichenheim, Dale Green. They worked too bloody hard to go out like that, and they didn't. That will have to be enough.